In the heart of the vast savanna, where life and death dance in an eternal balance, the real danger is not always the predator you can see, it's the power of nature you cannot control. For Ranger Ela, who had dedicated a decade of her life to protecting this untamed wilderness, it was a day that began with torrential rain and ended with a question that would challenge everything she knew about survival. The sudden, fierce flash flood swept away everything in its path. Ela was trapped, caught in nature's fury with nowhere to run. She had fought for hours, her body exhausted beyond measure, desperately clinging to a drifting tree trunk as the churning water tried to claim her life. Her face, usually strong and determined, now showed extreme fatigue. Yet even in her darkest moment, her eyes still held that final spark of hope, the will to survive that defines those who truly belong to the wild. The muddy brown waters surged around her, pulling relentlessly, each wave threatening to be her last. Her fingers were numb, her strength fading with every passing second. In the most perilous moments, when she felt her grip beginning to fail, a giant dark silhouette appeared on the riverbank through the curtain of rain. It was Czar, the renowned dominant male lion of the territory. His magnificent mane was heavy with rain, plastered against his powerful frame, and his amber eyes stared intently at Ela with a strange, focused intensity. He did not roar in threat. He did not circle with predatory intent. Czar just stood there, motionless, observing this struggle between life and death with an expression that seemed almost concerned. Ela knew the law of the jungle better than anyone. She was prey, and he was the ultimate predator. Yet in that instant, all the rules seemed to shatter. The lion did not look at her as a meal. He looked at her as something else entirely, a soul crying out for help. As a massive wave slammed into her, nearly washing Ela away for the final time, Czar suddenly turned his back. But he wasn't fleeing. He was running toward the sound of an engine echoing from somewhere in the distance, cutting through the storm. An unthinkable bond of courage and connection between human and animal had begun in the most unexpected way imaginable. Ranger Ela had been the soul of this reserve for 10 years. She had walked every trail, memorized every watering hole, understood every pride's territory. She knew Czar and his family well, the dominant male with his majestic appearance and superior intelligence. When the torrent swept her away at dawn, she had prepared for a solitary end. She had never imagined a miraculous intervention like this. The flash flood the night before had exceeded all predictions, transforming the gentle river into an angry monster. Ela had been trapped while checking surveillance equipment at a distant outpost when the waters rose with terrifying speed. Now every breath was a battle, every grasp a challenge against the biting cold and the destructive power of nature. She could feel her body gradually giving up, her consciousness beginning to fade. But on the bank, Czar showed no sign of moving on to hunt elsewhere. He stood there, his mane completely soaked, his powerful paws deeply rooted in the thick mud. Then he roared, but it wasn't a roar of warning or dominance. It was a low, urgent sound, full of restlessness and anxiety. His supreme predatory instinct had been overridden by something more powerful, something unnameable, a desperate desire to see life continue. Czar seemed to be struggling with his own helplessness against the current, pacing back and forth along the bank, never taking his eyes off the struggling ranger. The sound of a jeep engine suddenly cut through the forest's quiet chaos. Callum, a fellow ranger and Ela's close colleague, was driving the patrol route. He stopped abruptly when he saw Czar blocking the muddy path ahead. In the dim dawn light and the glow of his headlights, he expected the huge lion to scatter into the bush. Instead, Czar stood his ground. This completely contradicted every principle of animal behavior Callum had learned. Lions don't approach vehicles. They don't seek out humans. Callum, a man of logic and natural science, was completely stunned by what he was witnessing. However, Czar did not stand still for long. He turned his massive head to look directly at Callum, then back toward the raging river, repeating the action clearly and deliberately. The message was unmistakable. Follow me. Although every survival instinct screamed in protest, something in Czar's eyes conveyed an undeniable urgency, a plea that transcended species. Callum made a split-second decision. He restarted the vehicle, dimmed his high beams, and slowly followed the lion's silhouette through the rain. They moved along the treacherous, muddy forest path, Czar occasionally looking back to ensure the jeep was still following. When they finally reached the swollen riverbank, Callum gasped. Through the sheets of rain, he could make out a small, weak figure, about to lose all strength. Ela, barely clinging to life in the violent current. In that moment, everything became clear. The lion didn't need prey. He needed help. Callum and Czar now stood side by side, two beings from opposing worlds, sharing a single desperate purpose. A silent, powerful trust formed between them, a wordless pact that challenged all understanding of the wild. It was a moment when respect for life transcended the ancient law of predator and prey. Callum no longer had time to argue with rationality. The image of Ela desperately struggling with the flood was the clearest call to action he'd ever felt. He grabbed his coil of rope, quickly secured a life jacket, and kicked off his boots. The waves and frigid water were no longer his biggest concern. His colleague's life was paramount. He stepped down the muddy riverbank, his feet sinking deep into the sludge, the freezing rainwater seeming to drain his vitality with every step. He knew he was plunging into a deadly trap where the current could drag him away at any moment. But even in that terrifying instant, he felt something unexpected, a silent encouragement. Czar remained stationary on the bank, unmoving, watching. The lion's presence was no longer a threat, but a strange assurance. It provided not just the absence of danger, but a powerful motivation, a wild encouragement Callum had never experienced before. He entered the water. Each step became more difficult as the current rose to his chest, then his shoulders. He had to brace himself against the fierce flow, his eyes locked on Ela, who was slowly losing consciousness. The rope tied securely around his waist was the only lifeline for both of them. The water roared as if determined to tear everything apart. Ela had almost completely let go, her fingertips slipping from the bark, her head surfacing with increasingly long intervals between each desperate gasp. The boundary between life and death had become more fragile than a thread. Callum gritted his teeth, took one freezing breath deep into his lungs, and launched himself forward. The floodwater rose to his neck, cutting off his air, but his focus remained absolute. He surged toward her, arm outstretched. The first time, the icy current prevented contact, his fingers merely brushing her wrist. The second time, he grasped her firmly. Ela's wrist was ice cold, her pulse barely perceptible. But that weak contact was proof she was still alive, still worth saving. The current immediately swept them both downstream. The rope stretched taut, the anchor point on the bank enduring tremendous weight. Callum struggled to keep his head above water, using his body to shield Ela from the worst of the current's violence. On the bank, Czar made his most powerful gesture yet. He stepped closer to the water's edge, his claws digging deep into the mud, his eyes never leaving the two struggling humans. The tension in his muscles was the clearest expression of his participation in this rescue. He did not attack, but he also did not stand completely aside. He was bearing witness, lending whatever strength his presence could provide. As Callum fought his way back to shore, the water's strength seemed to double. He had to use every ounce of energy to maintain his balance and his grip. Ela's breathing was almost imperceptible, her body limp in his arms. The rope pulled them slowly but steadily towards safety. Finally, he began to feel solid ground beneath his feet. With the last few meters to go, the strength in his legs was almost gone, the cold constricting his muscles into painful knots. But he could not stop. The body in his arms wasn't just Ela. It also carried the silent trust of a lion who had chosen to save rather than to hunt. With one final, desperate effort, Callum collapsed onto the muddy bank, pulling Ela to safety beside him. His breathing was ragged, his body shaking violently from cold and exhaustion. But he had succeeded. Silence reigned for a moment, broken only by the relentless murmur of the river and the pounding rain. Two humans, a ranger and her rescuer, and one massive lion stood together in the gray dawn light, sharing an unbelievable victory against the brutal power of nature. Callum, covered in mud and shaking, knelt beside Ela. He checked her pulse with trembling fingers, weak but steady, still there. He carefully cushioned her head with his jacket, never taking his eyes off Czar. The lion approached closer, his massive body still dripping with rain, but his gaze held no aggression. In that most vulnerable moment, With both humans exhausted and defenseless, Czar maintained his position as a silent guardian rather than a predator. Normally, this distance would be a deadly boundary no human should cross, but not now. Czar's presence created something sacred, a space where the ancient laws of predator and prey were temporarily suspended. As Ila's chest gently rose with a deeper breath, the tension in Czar's eyes seemed to ease. The lion lowered his magnificent head, as if sniffing or merely observing the human who had escaped death's grasp. It was not the look of a predator toward prey, but the deep, silent concern of one living creature for another. Callum looked directly into Czar's amber eyes and realized something profound. This wasn't just about territory or instinct. Czar had wanted to save her. He had recognized a soul in danger and acted against every rule of the wild to ensure that soul survived. The sound of sirens and approaching engines broke the stillness. The rescue team was arriving, bringing the human world back into this moment of magic. Czar knew his mission was complete. He looked at Ila one final time, then turned away with heavy, deliberate steps, disappearing into the forest mist. His mane caught the first rays of dawnlight as he vanished. He needed no thanks, no recognition. His task had been to ensure survival, and he had done exactly that. Weeks later, Ila returned to the reserve, bearing not just physical scars, but a profound spiritual awakening. Standing on the hilltop overlooking the vast savanna, she was no longer merely a ranger doing a job. She was part of this complex, interdependent web of life, in a way she'd never fully understood before. Her life was a debt, not just to Callum, but to the land's most powerful creature. Together with Callum, she returned to the areas Czar frequented, not with fear, but with silent gratitude. Once, they spotted him far away on a rocky ridge. Czar looked at them for a brief moment, then disappeared. That single glance spoke volumes. The debt would be paid not with offerings or interference, but with the simple act of continuing to protect their shared home. This story challenges everything we think we know about the wild. It shows that trust can bridge even the widest chasm between species. Behind the chaos of nature exists a powerful desire in every creature to see life triumph over death. Think about the czars in your own life, the unexpected sources of strength who appeared when you were most desperate, who broke the rules to show you a different path. Our lives are always full of such silent miracles if we're willing to recognize them. If this story has touched your heart, help us continue this work. Every subscription directly supports conservation efforts in territories like this, ensuring that these improbable stories of connection continue to unfold. Share your own story in the comments below. Tell us about a time when someone or something unexpectedly stepped in and changed everything. Because the wild isn't just a place to escape, it's a place to learn the deepest lessons about compassion, trust, and the connections that bind all living things. Until next time, find your trust, cherish your connections, and remember, sometimes the noblest act is listening to what the wild is trying to teach us.